Hello and welcome to my workshop. I am Xerxes and in this video I am going to refurbish my old board that I've been using for my Warcry and Sculpting games. I began by using various tools to scrape off all the experiments that I've done on this board over the past couple of years. Mainly bits of textured wall paint, sawdust flock and some static grass. It took a while, it was annoying and I made a lot of mess, but hopefully, well, we'll see, it will save me some problems in the future. The idea was to put two hills on the opposite corners of the board. One slightly larger, one a bit smaller with a river, or a section of a river around it. Generally, if you play Sculpting or Warcry, a majority of the action takes place in the middle of the board, so I want to leave it kind of low detail, leave it for scattered terrain and some buildings that I'm gonna put before the game. But that allows me to put more details on the outside of the board, like the river, for example, that I'm marking right now. So I began by carving a piece of XPS board, make it look like a rock, just using your standard X-Acto knife, a butter knife and fingers to remove chunks of the polystyrene to create a texture, and a wire brush and sandpaper to remove the scraggly bits. And now I'm using different pieces of the polystyrene because the previous ones were glued with the glue that wasn't supposed to glue them, and they melted and warped. So, new plan. I roughly mark out the shapes that I want and use my Proxon wire cutter to cut them. You don't need that, you can use a knife, it's just faster. Then I beveled one of the hills to help me with one of the next steps with, forming the terrain. And the annoying bit, removing the paint to make the riverbed. I had to cut about an inch into the board. Then I removed some more paint and sanded the area where the hills are going to be glued in. I decided to create a small patch of rocky texture in one of the hills. I'm gonna add to it later, make it a bit more prominent. Now time to lay on some glue. This one is a bit old and thick, but hopefully it should work. Just making sure that it's flush with the edges of the board. And then I put something heavy on it to prevent it from warping and making sure it adheres quite well. The surface is not super even. I gave it some time to settle and then glued the outcrop that I carved earlier, after making sure that it's flush with the edge. I used some of the offcuts from the riverbed to create stones, or to expand the rock texture that I carved into the hills. I'm gonna fill the cabs with acrylic filler bit later to make it look like one thing. And then I used some more offcuts to create a pile of rocks or large stones that protrude from the ground. We'll blend them into the surface a little bit later. Yeah, sticking to the idea of putting detail in the corner or in corners of the board. Somewhere for the snipers to hide, maybe, and create that small terrain that gives you the extra benefit of cover. Because we all know that you just need to hide your half of your foot in the cover to get the benefit of cover. Okay, so it was time to clean the riverbed, remove some bits that were kind of standing out, sand them. And now, my homemade sculptor mold. So do you think a little bit of plaster, a little bit of paper pulp, and some water? Simple, right? Wrong. The problem is obviously water. If you add too little, it'll dry before you remove it from the container. If you add too much water, it'll probably take 20 years to dry. And another problem that I had was, when I blended my paper pulp, I didn't blend it well enough. So I had like little lumps of paper that really created issues with sculpting or, molding the terrain. Sculpting and molding. Yeah. So there are things that you need to pay attention to. There's something I've learned. But if you manage to get the tuna mayo consistency, this stuff is absolutely amazing. I mean, yeah, I'm working here pretty fast because now I've got too little water in the mixture, but the stuff that you can, blend and you can make really, really smooth transitions, this is awesome. So I was able to kind of create a really, really nice riverbed. So this is where I added a little bit too much water. But it allowed me to kind of blend it really nicely, but it was drying. It wasn't even properly dry when I was pouring resin a couple of days later. But now adding a bit more to the stones to blend them, as I mentioned, and now laying down some ground. So I pour some Mod Podge, spread it around to create a nice thick coat. Make sure that everything is nice and ready for the mixture of tile grout and coconut fiber substrate. If you haven't used the coconut fiber substrate, check it out. It's really awesome. It creates really cool, like, earthy texture. You can sieve it to get a really fine thing, or you can keep it quite coarse. There are some, obviously, fibers in there. There are small bits, there are big bits. So if you want an easy ground cover, that's the best way to go, I think. Prove me wrong by telling me that something is better. I mean, there's obviously soil, but I really, really like the coconut fiber thing. So after laying all that grout and fiber on the board, I sprayed it with isopropyl alcohol and then watered down Mod Podge to create a really nice hard shell. Then some large stones near the rocky outcrops to create a little bit of extra realism, I would say. And then some gravel to blend them with the ground. Also more gravel at the bottom of the riverbed to create those, stones that are streams or rivers, and then some coarse sand to basically, yeah, create the riverbeds and blend the rocks and gravel together even more. Now I finished off the riverbed with extra pieces of coconut fiber to simulate the pieces of wood. More isopropyl alcohol and more watered down Mod Podge. No, it really creates a very nice hard shell. It's really difficult to remove those stones after that. Just make sure that you let that dry. Unfortunately, I did have to glue those larger pieces of coconut fiber with super glue because the Mod Podge wasn't enough to hold them in place. So, spraying the board once more just to make sure that the message is clear. It will be a hard shell. And yeah, making a bit of a mess, but fortunately it's pretty easy to clean. Now, painting the rocks. I'm using, I think it's called leopard spot technique. You can see people doing washes, but unfortunately XPS board isn't as porous as plaster, for example, so it needs extra persuasion to hold paint, so I'm stippling instead of washing. And some as well to blend them, make sure that they've got the same color. So yeah, the colors I'm using are brownish, gray, just blending them even when they are wet, and finishing off with a bit of olive that I made, mixing yellow and a little bit of black. Yeah, the stones in the corners as well. And the last step is a black wash. Put it all, you know, nice. Make it nice. And now you can actually really see the texture of tile grout and coconut fiber. If you want to make like war-torn trenches, that's what I would recommend. And now more watered down Mod Podge to make the board ready for blocking. And more isopropyl alcohol. So yeah, I start with just pure fine coconut fiber substrate to create some, let's call it highlights. Create a transition between the sand and the soil. As you can see, I'm putting quite a lot. And now the first layer of foam block. I'm using a homemade kind of mid-green, like equivalent of your mid-tone. So I'm using fine block and some extra coarse to basically make it more granular. Then some extra dark block, create, let's say, a little bit of a shade, and light sort of yellowish to create a highlight, just to have some extra color in there, just to make sure that it's not monotone. And now I'm using some sawdust, but unfortunately it doesn't work as well as I wanted to, so I return with coconut fiber to kind of blend it back in. More coarse flock to create those, not necessarily bushes, but kind of, you know, just smaller patches of green. And then just going back and forth with different colors, blending them, trying to make something interesting. It's like blending paints on miniature, I would say. And yeah, more watered down Mod Podge to add another layer of very fine sand and kind of a tan colored tile grout to the banks and around the stones as well. And back with the coconut fiber to blend the sandy areas with soil areas, effectively. Yeah, so it's all, you know, back and forth. Quite an iterative process, I would say. So yeah, more sand and tile ground, then more coconut fiber, then more flock. Obviously trying to remove a tile ground from the stones. We don't want it on the stones. And you can actually pat those bigger pieces of flock to kind of squish them, make sure that they absorb the glue better. And yeah, as you can see, I'm adding more here and there. Nothing really organized, trying to make something random. And now, isopropyl alcohol. Man, them fumes from isopropyl alcohol. Woo! That was quite something. No. 2 out of 10 would not recommend. Don't be a muppet like me, and if you use isopropyl alcohol, ventilate your area. Fortunately, I was okay, but yeah, be careful. So yeah, spraying everything with watered down Mod Podge yet again, just to make sure that the flock absorbs it as well and adheres to everything. I'm paying extra attention to edges and corners because quite often they are neglected. And after that, I'm doing a dry brush to pick out the rocks. That's the next day after it all dried. That took probably 24 hours, roughly. And yeah, now rocks look really, really nice. And stones, obviously, as well. And the next step is static grass. So I apply some undiluted Mod Podge, and then I use a homemade static grass from twine. As I said, there's a lot of experimentation in this video with some interesting results. I mean, the problem with the homemade static grass, especially from twine, is that it really sort of bunches up together. So when you actually apply it with applicator, it doesn't stick really close to each other, as in individual fibers don't stick close to each other. Maybe it was the twine that I used, possibly, but generally when you use commercial flock or commercial static grass, there is no problem like that, or it doesn't create problems as such. So you can see that the layer is pretty thick, but when you remove it, there's actually not a lot left. So I'm doing 2 blends, and then you can see even after 24 hours, not everything is properly dry. But yeah, I'm using 2 blends on my own, the burnt grass or the dead grass that you've seen before and you're seeing right now, and the spring grass that I applied on a hill. I'm really happy with the blends, with the colors. It's just the application is a bit more annoying. But I'm experimenting with different materials even as we speak. Well, not exactly in this moment because I'm commenting. So yes, clump foliage, also homemade. So basically when I make my flock, I used some of it with extra Mod Podge to kind of make it stick together. and it's actually quite interesting. It works quite nicely. So I apply it to a few areas here and there. Also to make sure that it kind of stays out of the way, but also creates extra possibilities of cover. So yeah, it's quite natural to have it next to a river, next to the hill or the rocky outcrop, or next to the stones. And now I'm using the same color, but the fine flock, but the same color as the bushes. I didn't exactly like the way it blended with the other colors, so I kind of added extra coconut fiber to kind of hide that fact. And I applied watered down mod podge to the bushes to actually make them really hard, basically. And I actually decided to add extra set of clump foliage. This is commercial, I do believe it's knock, which is quite interesting. Different properties. And now extra flock, like a colored flock, to simulate some flowers on the bushes, because why not? And now the resin, yes, the most exciting bit. It was easier than I thought. So I blocked off the pieces of the parts of the board where the river is, to make sure that I'm not gonna get any spillage. And I mixed up the resin with the right ratio. I added some paint. Unfortunately, I didn't add a lot, so it actually stayed pretty clear. It kind of tinted it slightly, but not enough, as you can see. When I start pouring it, you'll see it as well. Yeah, there we go. And now all of you experienced resin pourers will say, he's gonna get bubbles. And yes, I did get bubbles. So yeah, you can see bubbles over here, and I wasn't fast enough with removing them, so I decided to use gloss gel to create wave effects. And now, as you can see, I'm using airbrush to kind of make them a bit better. And you can see the waves here, kind of, whilst I'm applying extra pigments. So those are pigments from Soilworks. I do believe it's dark mud, at least it's the darker one, and I don't remember the other one. It's a lot lighter, so I'm going back and forth in few areas to kind of blend them together to create interesting sort of clay and mud deposits, I would say. That's what it reminds me of. It doesn't really blend very well with the ground where the flock is, because it's quite dark. So I did have some issues with it, but yeah, I decided to run with it anyway. Why not? Experiments are experiments. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Now, more static grass. This time I used a commercial product that I had stashed away somewhere. I used it to blend some of the patches that I didn't like. And the last bit was a rock. It didn't look like a rock, it really annoyed me. So I added some stones on top of it to change the shape. And with that step, I finished the whole board. It was interesting, educational few days of my life, or few evenings effectively. There are certain things that I can like share with you, I suppose, some extra bits. For example, foam flock. It's amazing. It creates awesome texture. It sticks really well, a lot better than sawdust flock. The problem is, when you want to make a really fine flock yourself, it takes ages. You're gonna spend a lot of time with your coffee grinder if you want to make a lot of fine flock. It's great for coarse flock because it doesn't take a long time, but if you want something fine, I would probably recommend buying it. I do believe Geek Gaming Cynics has really cool fine foam flocks, so check him out. Other than that, what else? Static grass, I will experiment a bit more. You can use twine, just prepared to apply few layers, because one layer may not be enough to cover the area to your satisfaction. The benefit of your own flock is that it's not uniform. So for example, when you buy static grass, you buy 2, 4 or 6 millimeter. So when you cut it yourself, you cut it randomly, so it creates an even more sort of wild or wildly growing grass, which looks more natural. Another thing is colors. I wasn't exactly super convinced about the colors. Maybe the glue, the Mod Podge changed them slightly, and they got a bit more dull when they dried. So I actually got convinced that they work. I will probably try a lighter tile grout next time, because I used like a chocolate color. I'll try maybe bronze or something closer to the coconut fiber substrate color, because it's a really nice base, and the colors of the flock that I have blend really nicely with it. What else? So resin was quite fun to pour. As I mentioned, a lot easier than I expected. But unfortunately, I didn't expect it to kind of harden that quickly. So for example, after I poured it, I waited for about 10-15 minutes. I used like a hairdryer to remove some of the bubbles that turned up, but more kept turning up. So I thought, okay, I'll leave it for about 40 minutes or an hour. I will come back and then pop all the bubbles, you know, at the same time, at least majority of them. But when I returned after an hour, well, it was really hard. I mean, it wasn't like hard, but it was thick. So when I kind of moved it, it stayed. So I decided not to do anything. And when I tried to blow dry or dry the bubbles, it didn't work. So I left it. That's why I applied the gloss gel, and it actually worked out pretty nicely. So when you look at the river and when the light is not shining on it, it actually really looks like a fairly slow moving river, which is what I was aiming for. So that made me happy. So what else? Pigments, yeah, they kind of worked. The blending wasn't perfect, because probably if I used them before I applied the flock, that will work out a lot better. But, you know, lesson learned. You know, as I mentioned before, those were experiments. I am happy with the result. So it'll be the board that I will use for, let's say, presentations. Whenever I want to present a Kill Team game or a Warcry. So, for example, whenever our local club, or what's left of it, has like an outing or kind of doing presentations, so it'll be perfect. And obviously some games, some battle reports, so you will see some battle reports on the channel with the use of this board. So let me know what you think. What would you do differently? Do you think it was worth the effort? What I messed up? What I did wrong? Did you learn anything new? Or was it just nothing new to you? Let me know in the comments. And yeah, I will see you in the next video, and I will attempt to do something maybe silly, maybe crazy, maybe a bit stupid. Well, not too stupid, obviously, but something that will hopefully be it. So, thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.